Senator from Kentucky.
Trump derangement syndrome has officially come to the Senate. The hatred for the president is so intense that partisans would rather risk war than give diplomacy a chance. Does anybody remember that Ronald Reagan sat down with Gorbachev and we lessened the nuclear tensions? We need to still have those openings. Nobody is saying or excusing Russia's meddling in our elections. Absolutely. We should protect the integrity of our elections. But simply bringing the hatred of the president to the Senate floor in order to say, we're done with diplomacy, we're going to add more sanctions and more sanctions. You know what? I would rather that we still have open channels of discussion with the Russians. Kennedy, at the height of the Cold War, had a direct line to Khrushchev, and it may have prevented the end of the world. Should we be so crazy about partisanship that we now say, we don't want to talk to the Russians, we're not going to have relations with the Russians? We should stand firm and say, stay the hell out of our elections, but we should not stick our head in the ground and say we're not going to talk to them. I would like to see the Russians leave Ukraine. I think we could do it through diplomacy. We're not going to have it if we don't talk to them. I would like to see the Russians help more with North Korea, with denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We're not going to have it if we just simply heap more sanctions on and say we're not going to talk to the Russians, and anybody that talks to the Russians has committed treason. For goodness sakes, we have the former head of the CIA, John Brennan, gallivanting across TV, now being paid for his opinion, to call the president treasonous. This has got to stop. This is crazy hatred of the president. This is crazy partisanship that is driving this. For goodness sakes, we don't excuse Russia's behavior in our election, but we don't have to have war. We can still have engagement. We have engaged Russia throughout 70 years while also acknowledging the imperfections of their system, the parts of their system that we vehemently disagree with. The lack of freedom, the lack of human rights, and yet we had open channels of negotiation, open channels of communication. So I could not object more strongly to this. Mr. President, I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
The senator from Kentucky just told us he wants dialogue with Russia. He wants diplomacy with Russia, that he thinks it's important that we communicate with Russia. I agree. Who disagrees with that? There is not one word in this resolution that suggests that the United States of America should not aggressively engage in diplomacy with Russia to ease the tensions that exist between the two countries. What the senator said is totally irrelevant to what is in this resolution. What this resolution says is we're going to tell Russia, stop interfering in our elections. What this resolution is about is to tell Russia to stop interfering with democratic countries all over the world in their elections. What this resolution is about is saying that we should implement the sanctions overwhelmingly voted by Congress. What this resolution is about is that we will not accept interference with the ongoing investigation of Special Counsel Robert Mueller, and that what this resolution says is the president must cooperate with the investigation of Mr. Mueller. That's what this resolution is about. It has nothing to do with ending diplomacy with Russia at all. So that is just inaccurate, and I would hope that if not today, in the very near future, Republicans will join Democrats and do the right thing in our effort to preserve American democracy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator, that's Rand Paul, joins us now from Capitol Hill. He's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he supported President Trump's decision to meet with Vladimir Putin. Senator Paul, long time no see. Very good to see you this morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. Listen, you've heard the avalanche of criticism and negativity, appalling, shameful, disgraceful, shocking. It's coming from all sides, and I'm wondering, you're here this morning, you're doing a cleanup on aisle 3?
Well, you know, I think we ought to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. and decide whether or not we want to have conversations with even our adversaries. During the height of the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy had a direct line to Khrushchev, and I think the world is a safer and a much better place because we had that line of communication. We had ambassadors. Let me finish my question. If you're going to ask questions, let me finish.
All right, all right.
It was also, I think, a good idea that we've continued to have ambassadors and diplomatic relations with Russia, even though they are our adversaries.
Senator Paul, I don't think anybody would object to trying to have a good relationship with Russia. I think the problem is that he seemed to throw the American intelligence community under the bus while doing that. Is there a part of you that wishes? Is there a part of you that wishes?
I think that's incorrect. I think what you just said, that no one would object to him meeting with Putin. Every Democrat on Capitol Hill objected to him meeting with Putin. Every neoconservative and warmonger on the right also objected to it. So yes, the vast majority of the foreign policy community, the bipartisan consensus, said you shouldn't meet with Putin. They also said he shouldn't meet with Kim. And this is an extraordinary thing about President Trump that should be lauded and not belittled, is that he is willing to meet with adversaries to try to prevent us from having World War III.
Senator, you talked about the Cold War history, and one of the things that was distinct about both President Kennedy, you mentioned, and President Reagan was that they did two things. They both met with America's adversaries, and they were quite clear about America's moral view about the repression of both the Soviet Union and then subsequent to that, Russia now, which most people think is led by basically a dictator. What the president didn't do and is getting criticized for is he did not make that moral case. He basically said in the relationship between the two, both sides are at fault. That's the distinction here, not the whether to have the meeting. So what about that moral piece?
But I don't think you're being fair to the president. So when President Reagan met with Gorbachev, do you think he listed the litany of Soviet abuses from Stalin on in a one-to-one meeting? No, they were listed and recounted by other people in the administration. There have also been people within the Trump administration who have listed and recounted the human rights violations in Russia. But we also have to understand that we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. And if we're only going to talk to people who have perfect constitutional republics, we're going to have a very small audience, and we're going to have a lot of potential conflict with no outlet for diplomacy. So no, I think the president did a good thing by meeting with Putin, and I think it's a mistake for people to try to turn this into a partisan escapade.
Senator, President Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Many of his most famous comments are calling out the Soviet Union on its moral shortcomings. So I think that comparison between President Reagan and President Trump is off a bit. But let me ask you this question. It has also been the tradition for American presidents.
But I'll respond to that. I'll say Reagan also sat down with Gorbachev and didn't call it an evil empire in a press conference with Gorbachev. He also sat down with Gorbachev, and we also had strategic arms limitations. He actually did, while the rhetoric was strong, you actually might compare that to Trump's rhetoric with North Korea. It's been very strong, but he's been willing to sit down with him. I think there's actually some apt comparisons between Reagan and Trump on the diplomatic front.
The difference here is, Senator, that President Trump is not short about offering criticism to American allies, whether it's on the German gas deal or whether immigration is destroying Europe. But when it comes to Russia, he seems to have, in all instances, whether he's standing next to the Russian president or just quietly by himself in a one-on-one interview, bends over backwards to say nice things about the Russians, and that robs him of an opportunity to make a clear moral case about the distinction between America, which has grown up and had a history of supporting freedom, and the Russian regime, which does not do so. And why not take that opportunity as an American president?
I think what this gets into is that the president has undergone an onslaught of a year and a half of a partisan investigation accusing him of somehow colluding with the Russians. So I think he's sensitive to that. But there's another aspect to the investigation that is a legitimate one, and that is saying, did Russians hack Hillary Clinton's emails? And so there's a legitimate aspect, and then there's a partisan aspect. And we all have now concluded and all understand that the investigation was started by partisans, James Clapper, John Brennan, who started the investigation at the behest of the Clinton campaign, who paid somebody in Russia to come up with a dossier. So really, it's funny that we keep talking about Trump and Russia, when in fact the only person actually known to pay Russian agents was Hillary Clinton, who paid a British spy, who then paid British agents for concocted dirt on Trump.
I know we can go down that road again, but I still think the question remains, does he have to throw the American intelligence community under the bus? I still think that's a big question that people are asking. But we're going to have to leave it there, Senator.
One of the reasons for it is James Clapper's a known liar who's lied to Congress.
So for someone who's for transparency, Senator, a lot of people were outraged that this meeting took place privately. I think that was a lot of concern as well. But we're going to have to leave it there. We appreciate you joining us. Thank you.